Good morning, and welcome to today's meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California World Affairs. I'm Dr. Karen Philbrick, the Executive Director of San Jose State University's Mineta Transportation Institute, and your chair for today's program. MTI, as we're known by, is a US DOT-funded university transportation center that leads 4 competitively selected multi-university consortia. All of our work focuses on improving the mobility of people and goods, and we accomplish that through surface transportation research, technology transfer, education, and workforce development. We are guided by the mission of improving our nation's transportation system by making it safer, more convenient, more accessible, and cleaner. And every day we go to work, we honor the legacy of our founder, Secretary Norman Y. Mineta. And to that end, we are pleased to present the 15th annual Norman Y. Mineta Transportation Policy Summit, Beyond the Pump, Rethinking Transportation Funding Without the Fuel Tax. This program is presented by the Commonwealth Club of California World Affairs in partnership with the Mineta Transportation Institute. While the climate benefits from booming electric vehicle sales, the nation's transportation system faces an unfortunate predicament. Less gasoline and diesel purchased means dwindling fuel tax revenue. Fuel tax revenue provides a core source of funding for operating, maintaining, and improving transportation systems. So policymakers must find a replacement as soon as possible. Today, a select group of national experts will discuss the challenges with finding sources to replace lost fuel tax revenue. States and federal governments must weigh the challenges and the opportunities of relying on user taxes like a mileage fee or higher annual vehicle fees versus abandoning the user pay principle and relying on general fund revenue. That's a mouthful, and we've got a great conversation ahead of us. We begin our remarks with MTI researcher Dr. Asha Weinstein-Agarwal, who will be presenting the results of her research on transportation revenue policy, including the findings of MTI's 15th annual survey, asking the U.S. public their opinions about funding policy options. Next, we are very fortunate to hear from Jeff Davis, Senior Fellow with the Enos Center for Transportation. Jeff will provide an overview of federal transportation revenue policy, both past and present. That historical view will be very important for guiding the future. Following Jeff's remarks, we will move to a panel that's moderated by MTI trustee, Davey Kim. The panel brings together the leaders of 3 state departments of transportation who've been at the forefront of grappling with the tough policy choices that surround finding a replacement for lost fuel tax revenue. Our 3 distinguished panelists include Utah DOT Director Carlos Braceras, Oklahoma DOT Director Tim Gatz, and finally, and I wish I was in Hawaii, Hawaii DOT Director Ed Sniffen. I'm now pleased to introduce MTI's own Dr. Asha Weinstein-Agarwal. She is the director of our National Transportation Finance Center. She also leads our education program. She's one of our top researchers. She's a full professor, and she is amazing. She has been researching this topic for over 20 years, and she's going to enrich us with her knowledge. Asha, please share the findings of your survey probing U.S. public opinion about tax revenue options. Take it away.
So I am very pleased to be here today to share the results of this new MTI research on understanding what the public thinks about options for raising federal transportation revenue. Before I jump into the findings from our survey, however, I want to quickly share findings from another set of MTI research that tries to put some context when we talk about, is it time to worry yet about dwindling fuel tax revenue? And in particular, this conversation is so important because of the transition to electric vehicles. So we have done a research project to be exploring under different scenarios, how much revenue would California lose through 2040 if we, adopt electric vehicles, drive more or less vehicles in the state? And here is just one quick overview of what we learned. And here we have projected revenue from 5 different key California state taxes. But in particular, please look over there at the left, the gas tax. This is the gas excise tax. This year, we're raising, a little shy of $8 billion from the gas tax. And you will see all those lines plummeting downwards. That's ending up at 2040. And this is showing us how much gas tax revenue we will be losing each year under 8 different scenarios, some with very slow transition to electric vehicles, some with fast. And so again, the key point here, it's plummeting under all of these different scenarios. The next 2 figures show diesel tax revenue in the state, and that's a much smaller fraction of the revenue the state's raising. But, it's going down for the excise tax, and for the sales tax, it could go up a little bit if the price of diesel goes very high. The last 2 figures here show 2 California annual vehicle registration fees. And in particular, I just want to draw your attention to the last one, the RIF, the road improvement fee. Here we do see revenue increasing, and that's because this is a tax just on electric vehicles. So if we add all those 5 up together, that's what this shows us. And you'll see again that in every case, revenue is falling. These, by the way, are inflation-adjusted dollars. And in many cases, it is falling quite dramatically. So clearly we need to do something, and we need to do something before 2040. It's not that far off at this point. So now let me turn to our brand new public opinion poll. And this is a project that we have been running with MTI funding since 2010. So this is year 15. And we survey a random sample of the US public to ask their opinion about different options for raising federal transportation revenue, in particular through either raising the federal gas tax rate or adopting a new mileage fee. The surveys have been a mix of phone and online. We've always had a nice big sample. Last 2 years, actually, we've had 2,500 respondents each year. And finally, I do want to acknowledge my co-author, Hillary Nixon, who's MTI's deputy director. So first thing I want to show you is this year, what did people tell us about their willingness to support a mileage fee? And we asked them about 5 different variants on this idea. So the top 2 blue bars are asking people if they would support a mileage fee to replace the federal gas tax. And one version we asked simply told people 3 cents per mile for everyone. That's the top bar with 39% support. And then we also said, well, what about if we had an average charge of 3 cents per mile, but their more polluting vehicles pay a higher rate and less polluting vehicles pay a lower rate? And here we see 51% support. And what I want to emphasize is not exactly the 39 or the 51, but the fact that there is a pretty substantive difference between those 2. More people were supportive of this mileage fee if it had that, what I'll call the green rate versus a flat rate. Now, the 3 yellow bars below are where we asked people, well, what about if we kept the federal gas tax rate, but for commercial travel, we added on a mileage fee? And we asked people if they would support that for delivery and basically trucks, for ride-hailing vehicles and taxis. And in all cases, we did see majority support for that idea of a mileage fee. So that's the snapshot in time for this year. Now, this next slide is showing you what have the trends been over time for that green rate and flat rate mileage fee. And so here's from 2010 to 2024. And what I want to emphasize here is 2 things. First of all, for both the green rate and the flat rate, the blue line, there's a general upward trend. Overall, people today are more likely to support these concepts than they were in 2010. And then secondly, that the green rate is always more, has higher support than the flat rate. This seems to have narrowed in the last 5 years or so, but it is a very clear trend. It's not like one year we surveyed an odd group of people. This seems to be consistent. Now, we also asked a number of different questions to probe people's ideas of what kind of a rate they might like for a mileage fee. And today I'll just share one other thing we asked, which was if Congress adopts a mileage fee, would you support or oppose charging a lower rate to low-income drivers? The public is very clear. 64%, close to 2/3, support the idea of a lower rate for low-income drivers. So next, I'd like to turn to a few findings about fuel taxes. One thing is, I think it's always important to remember how little the public knows about gas taxes, which is not a criticism of people, but just a fact. By the way, I don't know how, the details of how my trash collection is paid for because I don't study that. So we asked people, though, as best you remember, when did the US Congress last raise the federal gas tax rate? The correct answer is 20%, and 2% of people correctly identified that. More than half said they don't know. And then we had quite a number of people who thought that it had been raised within the last few years. So this next slide here is showing support when we asked people about the idea of raising the federal gas tax rate by 10 cents per gallon. And we asked 6 different variants of that. And in each case, what changed was how we told people the money raised would be spent. So at the very bottom, we have what I'm calling the base case, where we simply told people, would you support that rate increase if the money were spent for transportation? No other details given. And here we only have 40% support. However, in the other variants, we told people that the revenue would be dedicated to a variety of different things: air pollution, global warming, congestion, safety, and maintenance. In all cases, support was much higher than the base case. And in particular, the idea of dedicating the revenue to maintenance or safety was extremely popular, with 70% of people saying they would support those. So again, what I want to stress is that the exact numbers on these slides, I think, are less important than the difference between the support for the different taxes. Clearly, how we spend the money and how we communicate that and commit to the public is critical. So I'm going to just end on last slide, other than conclusions here, by just showing you the trends in support for these different options for increasing the federal gas tax rate. And similarly with the mileage fees, 2 key things to notice. One, overall, the lines are generally sloping up over the period. And then secondly, year after year, we see that people are more likely to support certain versions of these taxes than others, with maintenance and safety, those top blue bars, being by far the most highly supported. So just to wrap up, what does all this mean as we think about moving forward for policy? First, I would say we're figuring out a way to replace the fuel tax, the lost fuel tax revenue, is urgent. We have a few years, certainly. Some states might have longer than California. But here in California, for example, we could be losing $1 billion annually from fuel taxes within just 3 years. On a hopeful note, the public does seem to be willing to support replacement options. We were, of course, focusing on the federal level, but I would expect similar patterns to hold for state taxes. So we found that support for raising revenue through either a gas tax or a mileage fee has been gradually, but steadily rising since 2010. There seems to be a public acknowledgement that we need to fund our systems better. The second thing, and I think this is absolutely critical, whatever we relied on, gas taxes, mileage fees, annual vehicle registration fees, I think that we can take away from this survey that how you spend the revenue is critical, and how you communicate that to people. If you tell them it's going to be for maintenance and safety, they will be much more supportive. And then finally, that how we structure the rate for a mileage fee will also influence support. with people seeming to prefer a lower rate for low-income drivers and what I had been calling the green rate that varies by pollution level. So with that, I'm wrapping up. I thank you for your interest, and I will turn it back to Karen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your findings. And I'm reminded year after year that this trend analysis is not only showing consistency, but continues to show that increased support when you're linking that to specific investments, particularly related to maintenance and safety. And we all know that in the absence of objective scientific data, it's hard to align decisions and dollars. So thank you for being at the forefront of this critical body of work, which has influenced so many decisions already. We really benefit from your expertise and your dedication. And now we get to hear even more. It's time to turn to Mr. Jeff Davis, Senior Fellow at the Eno Center for Transportation. He is the author of the Eno Transportation Weekly, which is a heroic lift and very informative, and one of the most respected experts on federal transportation policy, both in the past and in the present. His work focuses on the analysis of the federal transportation budget and long-term trends in transportation funding and policy. Jeff, you're just the man to put the link in here. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, Karen. At the federal level, the user pay principle dates back to the founding. Yesterday's Supreme Court opinion by Justice Thomas in the Consumer Protection Bureau case actually reminds us that in the very first Congress in 1789, they established ship registration fees that funded the salaries of the registration officers, and then set up a post office supported by the user fees paid by mail recipients. In 1951, Congress passed a proviso that is still on the books, declaring that the beneficiaries of special government services should have to pay for those services where possible. 5 years later, the Federal Highway Program was placed on a user pay, user benefit basis with the creation of the Highway Trust Fund and the segregation of motor fuel taxes and trucking taxes from the rest of the budget. As you can see, this worked out pretty well for 50 years. Almost $687 billion was spent on highways, and towards the end, mass transit, paid for almost entirely by highway user taxes, plus $10.6 billion in interest earned by unspent highway trust fund balances. But even if you don't count the interest as real user money, that's still 98.5% self-sufficient on user taxes for the first 50 years. It's a pretty good record. But throughout that time, there were two trends taking place, making it more difficult to continue the user pay system. The first macro trend is that the annual growth rate of motor vehicle travel has been declining. Motor fuel taxes are a proxy for VMT, as is the tire tax on trucking. From 1956 to 1978, VMT grew fast enough to double every 16 years, meaning Congress didn't have to bother to raise tax rates because the underlying activity being taxed grew so fast. After the OPEC and then especially the Iran oil shocks, the rate of growth of VMT slowed to where it was only going to double every 30 years. And then after the significant oil prices in 2004 increased, VMT growth slowed significantly to the point that it was only going to double every 90 years. And the sort of pyramid scheme of finance could no longer be supported. At that point, plus the kind of system you're going to design, a system where VMT doubles every 16 years should be designed very differently from a system that it's only going to double every 90 years. So it's almost completely inconsistent there. And as you can see here in the slide at the bottom, the current forecast from FHWA, which I think is the official spring 2023 forecast, only calls for VMT to increase at an aggregate rate that would double every 120 years. So the rate of increase in VMT has been slowing down since the mid-1970s. And as the rate of VMT increase kept going down, the gas tax became a worse and worse proxy for that VMT because of increasing fuel efficiency standards. This chart shows that the average vehicle on the road, this includes heavy trucks, all kinds of vehicles, gets about 50% better gas mileage in 2022 than it did in 1960. And you can see in the graph that when the CAFE standards started going in 1978 was when the initial upward trek began. And then they slowed down after they stopped getting increased in the 1990s. And if the Biden administration's new regulations stay on the books, fuel efficiency is going to increase significantly in the next 25 years. There was a July 2023 study from the MIT Mobility Initiative and JTL Transit Lab estimated that EV adoption at the rates they were estimating in 2023 will cause total gasoline receipts in the U.S. at current law tax rates to drop by almost 2/3 over the next 25 years. So you combine the slowing of VMT growth and the worsening proxy the gas tax is for VMT growth, and you get, I'm very proud of this chart because it's got about 8 different things in it. You've got the blue columns are actual motor vehicle gasoline tax and trucking tax receipts and interest, 2007 on the left all the way to 2034 projection. The periodic green columns on top of those are the general fund bailouts, $245 billion in counting, in the year they're going to be spent, so it's less lumpy. And then the red line on top of that is the spending out of the trust fund. So you can see that by how far the red trend line going up in spending and the gasoline tax and diesel tax and trucking tax together still going to be about flat because the decreasing gas tax is going to be offset a bit by increased trucking usage. So by 2031, 1 out of every $2 spent by the trust fund will not be supported by user taxes. Say that again. In 7 years, the Highway Trust Fund will be minority user pay. That doesn't even begin to count all the regular and IIJA general fund appropriations that we've been given to mass transit for years and are now been given to highways since 2018. That's at least another $20 billion a year, plus the occasional emergency relief. That imbalance makes the switch to any kind of real user pay system problematic, politically speaking. And again, the polling that Asha just showed was all about trading in a gasoline tax for a VMT fee at around 3 cents a mile. And again, right now, I believe that the federal one is 0.8% per mile. So the key to getting political buy-in is to convince voters that this new VMT system or whatever the user fee system is, they're only going to be paying the same amount of tax they were paying beforehand. You're just switching the different mode of collection. But that only makes sense when the trust fund's in balance. Trying to convince people that they should have their tax rates doubled and switch to a new, potentially more privacy intrusive system is, politically speaking, a much, much bigger haul. Getting voters to double their tax burden is very different than getting them to maintain their current tax burden. At the federal level, so that's the fundamental problem, is that even if you switched out dollar for dollar, we'd still be in exactly the same horrible situation as you currently are with the fuel taxes because of past drift. At the federal level, this is combined with the tax administration problem. Motor fuel taxes are fantastically easy to administer. Only somewhere between 1,200 and 1,300 points of collection nationwide. It's the refinery or what they call the rack, the tank farm, depending on if the refinery and the tank farm have common ownership or not. So there's about 1,200 to 1,300 different points of collection. And it only takes a de minimis amount of IRS manpower to collect from, a few score actual taxpayers at 1,200 or 1,300 points of collection, audit it and collect $35 billion a year in fuel taxes. It's phenomenally easy. Everyone should read the recent book, The Drive for Dollars, How Fiscal Politics Shaped Urban Freeways and Transformed American Cities, by Brian Taylor, Eric Morris, and Jeffrey Brown, which makes a strong argument that it was the gas taxes' ease of administration and reliable growth that allowed state DOTs to impose their design and engineering standards and proposed expressway maps on the relatively impoverished cities and counties who could not effectively raise their own revenues to compete with the gas. As you can see, if you make a move to maintain user pay and you don't tax the fuel, you're going towards taxing either the vehicles or the drivers. And either way, as the slide shows, you're going to increase the number of points of collection of a federal user tax 200,000-fold. To this day, and I'm kind of upset by this, Congress has never received any kind of official briefing or statement from the Treasury Department or the IRS as to how much manpower and equipment would actually be required to establish a national VMT fee. My grandparents drove occasionally for the last decade of their mobility. They weren't paying any income tax, had no relationship with the IRS because they weren't making any income, but they would still drive. How much is it worth the IRS to put a box in their car, in their cherry red PT Cruiser they used to have, and chase them down for what would have been $40 or $50 a year because they didn't drive that much. So there are all kinds of administrative issues here at the federal level, especially, that don't exist necessarily at the state level, would be easier at the state level. a user pay system modeled more closely after the fuel tax system, once the EV transition is most complete, would be a tax on the electricity to charge EVs. The problem is this would be pretty straightforward at public charging stations, but doing so for home charging is impossible unless you pay someone to install a rather expensive sub-meter in the home so you can tell the difference, between the electricity spent to charge the EV versus the electricity spent to run the air conditioning and the fridge and whatnot. That's a different kind of, intrusion in the home, or in privacy, I mean. An interim measure, a tax on EV batteries dedicated to the trust fund, was supposed to be in the IIJA authorization bill in 2021. But the fact that that bill got hijacked by a bipartisan group of 10 senators and removed outside the committee process before the finance committee could consider the bill meant that that provision didn't go in there. So by the time Congress is able to consider trust fund solvency again, and realistically speaking, they don't consider the reauthorization bill until the trust fund's going to run out of money. This was supposed to happen in 2026, but because interest rates are so high, unexpectedly from 2021, the trust fund is earning 5.75% interest on what's left of the $118 billion bailout they got in the IIJA, which is most of it's still left. So the high interest rates have enabled the trust fund to stay solvent now for almost 2 years longer than they thought when the IIJA was being drafted a few years ago. So now the trust fund's not going to run out of money till mid-late 2028, and Congress isn't going to do anything about the reauthorization until then. But about starting the transition to the next user pay system if we're going to. So by that time, it may be too late, politically speaking, to ever get back to user pay solvency again, in which case we have to consider a much smaller user pay system and a much larger annual general revenue fight for the remainder of surface transportation. But that's about all I have, and I'd like to turn it over to the panel now.
Thank you so much for your time, Jeff, and for your expertise. We all benefited from your remarks. Keep doing that great work and providing the perspective that gives us the information we need to build on. It's now my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's discussion with state DOT leaders, and that is Mr. Davey Kim. He is a Mineta Transportation Institute trustee, and he's currently working for WSP in the position of Senior Vice President and Principal for National Transportation Policy and Multimodal Strategy. He comes from a wealth of industry knowledge, having worked in both the public and the private sector. In fact, he was the Secretary of Transportation for the State of California Transportation Agency. So he's got lots of firsthand experience with some of these really interesting topics. So Davey, with that, please take it away and lead our panel discussion.
Let me introduce our three distinguished panelists in the order they'll first be speaking. And I'm going to share just a few details about each since their bios are in the program. Carlos Braceras joined the Utah Department of Transportation in 1986 and has served as executive director since 2013. In addition to his many years of service with Utah DOT, Carlos is a past chair of both AASHTO and the TRB Executive Committee. Tim Gatz is executive director of the Oklahoma Department of Transportation. He joined the department more than 30 years ago and started out as a drafting technician. His previous roles include serving as Oklahoma Secretary of Transportation and executive director of the Oklahoma Turnpike Authority. He currently chairs the Committee on Funding and Finance for AASHTO. And then we have Ed Sniffen, director of the Hawaii Department of Transportation. In this role, Ed focuses on improving safety, preservation, and upgrades of Hawaii's transportation systems. He also pursues opportunities and innovative strategies to positively impact state goals related to housing, energy, food security, education, and climate resiliency. So I'm going to start by posing two questions to each of our panelists in turn, and then we're going to move into a free-flowing conversation. So here's the first question for the panel. What are the key revenue sources that currently pay for roads and transportation in your state? Carlos, can I ask you to please start?
Yes. Yes, thank you, Davey, and to the rest of my panel members, hello. It's great to work with everyone. And listening to Asha and Jeff ahead of time, there's there's a lot of information in what they presented. So great to be part of this. So I would say the word that I would come to mind for Utah DOT, and something that we've been working on since the early 2000s, is diversification. We always, when we talk about revenue, and I think as transportation professionals, sometimes we jump to the revenue side of things way too quickly. We need to start with why we need revenue, how we use it, and we need to always be talking about how we are effective and efficient with the use of the public's money before we start talking about, I need more, and I always go back to, maybe that I shouldn't say that, old Oliver movie of give me more, sir. So diversification. We are a fast-growing state, and that's something that our legislature and governors are very focused on, is trying to meet that growth to keep the quality of life that we love here in Utah. And so 52% of our funding is actually, this is taking all of our funding revenue sources together, is actually general fund, state sales tax. By statute, we take down 21.68% of the state sales tax. And when the legislature made that decision in the 2000s, they still wanted to have a user pay system. That's very important, that concept for us. And so they looked at the amount of revenue generated through sales and use tax on automobile related services and automobiles themselves. And so that's where that 21.68% came from, and it's in statute. It can be used for building capacity, and any capacity we build for that, we can operate and maintain it as well. Our state gas tax is 22%. It is indexed, and that includes also our state registration fees as well. And those registration fees are indexed as well. We use all of our transportation fund and federal money for just basically taking care of what we have and operating the system. We keep all of our federal money on very simple edge oil to edge oil type of projects. Our federal funds are 18% of our funding package. And so, critically important, but it's a small part of our funding package. And then we have state funding for transit. It's about 4%. That's also coming from sales tax, because our gas tax and vehicle registration are constitutionally earmarked for roads. And so we have to keep it there. And then we have another 4 different funds spread out, things like aeronautics, active transportation. It's about 2% of our funding. But basically, it's a very diversified portfolio where we're attempting to keep that portfolio tied to a user connection. And we're very clear about why we need it and how it's used. So, Davey, sorry if I went too long on that.
No, that's great, Carlos. Thanks. Good to have that diversified portfolio. Tim, let's go to you next.
Again, Davey, thank you, and certainly a great honor to be on the panel with my distinguished colleagues, Carlos and Ed, 2 of my favorite DOT directors, and certainly, again, great to see you guys. In Oklahoma, for many, many years, motor fuel tax did make up the majority of our transportation revenues. Back in 2006, we started, as Carlos pointed out, a conversation about diversifying those revenue streams. And, fast forward to today, here in Oklahoma, we have motor fuel tax in the traditional form, which means it's not indexed. It's a pure volumetric motor fuel tax. I point out that it's the 45th lowest motor fuel tax in the United States. But we also have revenue inputs from motor vehicle registration fees. And that would include, not just registration, but excise tax, license, trucking permits, and things like that. So that makes up a component piece of it. And also, we have infused income tax revenue into our transportation revenues over the course of the last 20 years or so. And that's been a real difference maker for us. So worrying over motor fuel tax and, anticipating a little bit the need to do that diversification is something that we've been thinking about for a while. It's not a new concept. If you look at how Oklahoma's transportation revenues are comprised, we're not as fortunate as Utah. Our federal funding makes up about 50%, maybe a little more than 50% of our total revenues that we have for investments in our transportation system. As far as component percentages, our motor fuel tax still represents the bulk of our investment revenue. And again, that's going to be about 60%. Income tax is going to comprise about 28% of our state revenues. And then again, those motor vehicle registration fees are going to make up the rest at about 32%. And again, it takes all of those revenue streams. The important concept there is that creates a level of balance, across your portfolio, if you would. But it does not come with challenges, because we are in a constant conversation about potential reduction in income tax levels, and that, trying to make sure that Oklahoma taxpayers keep as much of their dollars in their pockets as they can, which is a hugely important concept here. So again, it will be an ongoing conversation for the foreseeable future, just as it is at the federal level. So again, appreciate the opportunity to be on the panel, and really look forward to some good conversation today.
Great. Thank you, Tim. Ed, let's go to you.
Thanks so much, Davey. Love being on with Carlos and Tim, because I can just ditto everything they said. In general, Hawaii set up kind of like Tim's state. Our federal funds are about 40% of our revenues. But if we're looking at the state side, we don't get any general funds put into the state's transportation system. So everything we get, or everything we do, is funded internally. Right now, fuel tax is about a third of our state revenues. Another third is our vehicle weight tax. And registration fees and rental car surcharge together make up another third. So in general, that's our picture for the system. For us, reductions in that fuel tax, it has tremendous impacts on what we can do for our public.
All right. Thank you, Ed. All right. So let's turn to the next question. What circumstances initially led your state to consider adopting a per mile fee as a replacement for fuel tax revenue? Let's start with Tim, and then we'll go to Ed, and then Carlos.
Thank you, Davey. And I think it's more than anything, our legislative leadership really wanted us to be attentive to what we all see is coming. And that's certainly a flattening of motor fuel tax revenues. And that really was a driver and a motivator for us to start to take a look at what a road user charge might offer. And that led to our pilot. So again, it was our legislature kind of driving that conversation, asking that we take a hard look at some options. And, the road user charge concept is not something certainly Oklahoma's unfamiliar with, having one of the largest toll networks in the country, which is also a road user charge. But so again, it was just more of anything, a desire from our legislature to have us collect some information and give them some information so they can begin to consider and make good policy decisions on a go-forward basis.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Tim. Thanks. Interesting how your legislature was in the driver's seat on that. Ed, let's hear from you.
Yeah, for us, Hawaii has some really aggressive clean energy goals coming up in 2030 and 2045. In order for us to meet those goals, we're going to be looking at significant electrification of our fleets, both private and public. With that electrification, should we hit those numbers, there would be significant reductions in state revenues that would come into the DOT. On top of that, if we start looking at IIJA and IRA and the potentials that we have for discretionary funds coming into the state, if we lose those funds, not only do we compromise our mission in keeping everybody safe and connected throughout the state, but we also potentially lose the opportunity to bring in more federal funds because we don't have the match for it. Given all of those together and looking at making sure that we have the revenue streams that are necessary for the state to do our job, if we increase the fees for fuel, just to make sure we keep our current levels, we now start balancing our system on the backs of people who can't afford to electrify. And that's just not fair. So for us, we pushed on this endeavor because of an equity piece. We wanted to make sure that everybody's paying their fair share for the system.
Great. Thank you, Ed. Carlos?
Yeah, I love the word he just used. It's so important, fairness. I'll go back to the mid 90s. We were working on a very large reconstruction of I-15 through Salt Lake County. And then we got the Olympics awarded, and we took a project that was going to be 10 years. We said we had to finish it in 4 years. And that ended up being our first, I think it was the first in the country, design build project in the country. But as soon as we finished that, just prior to the Olympics, we started having conversations with the legislature because they're like, wow, that was $1.32 billion. And that was the first time we used general funds, state general funds. And it was every year they had to come forward and appropriate. It was very painful at the time. And they started asking the question, well, the county to the south, Utah County, that's growing even faster than Salt Lake County. How are we ever going to get to rebuilding the roads down there? And they got nervous. So they created a transportation planning task force. And now those of us in the DOTs, we all have legislative sessions. Ours is a wonderful 45 days. Well, this is, okay, now we're going to go through session, but then we're going to have this full-time legislator, it was all full legislators, task force meeting for 2 years to understand transportation. And they started with what are the needs, looking at the long-range plans of all of our MPOs and of the state. And then they started looking at the revenue sources that were in place already and the gas tax. And that's when they realized that the gas tax alone couldn't do it, and the gas tax would not even be able to keep up with maintaining and operating our state road system, because they were looking 30 years out at this. And that, as painful as it was to be working with a full-time legislature going through these minute details, some amazing champions that were part of that task force came out. One of the co-chairs ended up becoming Speaker of the House. One of the members of the task force is the current president of our Senate. And they came out of that task force with a couple of things. One, that nexus between sales tax and transportation. So we could say we have a user fee in the sales tax, that 21.68 I presented. It was also where they said, you know what, from a fairness perspective and the fact that the gas tax is not going to have a long-term sustainability, we need to start moving towards a road usage charge program. And so that direction came out of that recommendation out of that task force in 2004. And so we were doing tests and pilots since that point. But it wasn't until the 2018 legislative session where we were directed, you come up with a full operating system by January of 2020. So January of 2020, not only do I think most people remember it as kind of when we first became aware of COVID, that's when we launched our full operation system. We have 5,000 users in it right now. And it's well received. I mean, it was a difficult conversation initially because it was looked at as a negative for motivating people to go to electric vehicles. And so we had to have that conversation how that this can be, it's fair for everyone. But the points of collection continue to be the challenge that Jeff mentioned. We tax at the rack. We have 26 collection points when we do fuel tax. It's very effective, very efficient. We are now transitioning to our second phase of, I'll say, our second mode for road usage charge in an attempt to drive down those collection costs. We anticipate to be able to break even, listen to that, break even next year. And so we're not making money with road usage charge at this point, and we're learning a lot, but we have a long ways to go to figure out this model, because looking at the work that Jeff has been doing, I think this country needs to think about what do we need to do to maintain what we have and grow what we need to have?
Thanks, Carlos. What I hear all of you saying is that legislative champions have come to the surface as a result of all of the studies, task forces, and analysis that have been done by your departments as well as the legislature. So that's a really interesting facet of everything that's happening here. Well, speaking of Jeff Davis, what he presented earlier was interesting. All of it was interesting, especially the fact that at the federal level, general fund transfers or bailouts have been a key feature in recent years. So we're going to enter into a little bit of a free-flowing conversation. So here's a question. How committed are legislators and the general public in your state when it comes to paying for transportation with user fees, as opposed to drawing from general fund revenue, as the federal government has been doing for the past many years? why don't we start with Ed and then we'll go to Carlos and Tim.
That's a little bit of a loaded question that I think our general public would rather be committed not to paying for these things. But I get what you're saying. So the legislators are very committed in our conversion, which is why they passed our legislation that requires us to go through an opt-in for EVs in 2025, getting rid of the opt-in in 2028 for EVs, making sure we have a plan in 2026 to move forward to all light-duty vehicles by 2033. So in one piece of legislation, they give us the roadmap to how we complete our conversion for road user charge. One of the big things that came with that was to ensure that we were just talking about one policy piece. There was a discussions in that time frame of increasing our rates to ensure we can increase our revenues at the time. Also putting in some green fees types of discussions. What we found was when we started pushing forward on those types of things without just considering a straight conversion, it got really unwieldy for legislators and for the public. So we had to bring it back down, make sure we just converted going from fuel tax to road user charge. And with that, we were able to move everything forward very, very quickly.
It's excellent. Tim.
So in Oklahoma, and again, we've been working on the policy side of this for many, many years. And, we were early with some of the EV policy, much like Ed in Hawaii and certainly Carlos with having a registration fee, which for all practical purposes is a road user charge on electric vehicles. And that was intended to make up some of the difference of the loss of revenue in the motor fuel tax front. And just so you have a little bit of perspective, the average Oklahoman pays about $110 a year in motor fuel tax. If you ask John Q. Public that same question, they'll tell you it's got to be tens of thousands of dollars a year, but it's really not. So that was an important move. We also were an early adopter on a kilowatt tax at a charging station, certainly recognizing the challenge that presents with trying to keep track of, residential charging and things like that. But also, when you look at road user charges, again, Oklahoma has one of the largest toll networks in the country, and our citizenry is not unfamiliar with that road user charge, the idea of it, and is very accepting as long as they understand what those revenues are being used for and how they're being managed. So nobody likes to pay a toll, but again, you've got to make it clear that those revenues are dedicated in expanding and enhancing that toll network. The other fact of that is, as we pointed out, Oklahoma's motor fuel tax is 45th lowest in the country. So that road user charge that's associated with that toll network has kept a tax burden off of our citizenry. So again, we try to put everything into that type of a context, when we're talking about road user charges. And I think that's been extremely helpful to us. Just the fact that our citizenry, for all practical purposes, is not unfamiliar with that concept. The other unique aspect with a toll network is about 40% of the revenues that, are associated with our toll network come from out-of-state travel. So again, that's going to be a real challenge for us as we get further and further into exploring road user charge options across the country. So,
Tim, it's really interesting that your extensive toll road network almost makes it a little easier for the public to understand and maybe even accept the concept of per mileage fees. So that's a really interesting facet. Carlos, what are your thoughts? Oh, Carlos, I think you are on mute.
You think I would learn by now. I apologize for that. I want to tag a little bit on the toll concept here. We came out of that task force I talked about with direction to implement a hot lanes, high occupancy tolling lanes. So we now have a continuous 82-mile continuous section of variable price tolling that again, I think I agree with you. I think it has definitely helped people understand that, I'm going to pay for this service, and they know exactly that any of the revenue stays in a tollway restricted account and is only used on that system. So I think that's a pretty powerful message for people to have. I want to go back at the federal level because, it wasn't, maybe it was a long time ago, it doesn't feel that long ago, where our biggest concern, when we talked about the Highway Trust Fund, was we thought the door would only swing one way. And we were holding this door shut because we didn't want any of those Highway Trust Fund revenues to leak out and get used for other stuff. And, but we were very happy to see the door would swing the other way, and we'd start to accept some of that general fund money in just so that we could, keep our expenditures almost the same with a small amount of growth in there. And what I've become convinced of is it's harder for, I'll say, federal legislators, state, we have to balance our budget. But I think it's harder for federal legislators to cut than it is to add. And so we're finding ourselves in a position where I think, Congress at some point is going to have to come face to face with the realization that through inaction, they've created a situation where it's going to be very difficult to put the genie back in the bottle and just go straight back to a gasoline tax to fund the Highway Trust Fund. I really don't see that. And so, we've been working at AASHTO on a project looking at how we could really define what the future is for transportation in this country and why that transportation system is really fundamental to everything that Americans have. It's about moving people and the things that people need. And if it works, no one notices it's there. It's when it doesn't work that it starts to become a problem. And so I think we're going to have to do a better job of explaining why those general fund monies are part of that portfolio of revenue to fund transportation at the national level. Because I don't think, we could see a gas tax big enough that would actually make up that difference and allow for some sustainability going forward. So we're looking at road usage charge right now is not making extra money. We're looking at trying to build it into a system where at the state level, we can start to transition to the road usage charge as we're seeing the decrease in the revenues coming from the gas tax. And so we've got a pilot going right now where we're combining both our road usage program with our express lane system and trying to merge the back office operations to create efficiencies between those two. And there's some challenges with that. Just like anything, anytime somebody says something's easy, that means they've never done it before, or it's been a really long time since they actually done it and they don't know exactly how things work anymore. And so we see these pilots and projects that the states are doing as really, this is where the federal government is really never on the bleeding edge of things. And so that we want the states to be out there willing to take a little bit of risk, and the federal government's going to benefit from learning from what the states are going through right now. Because I still think there is a role for some, with that user pay. I think it's important to establish that connection, but there's a role of a road usage fee. Maybe it's through just a more straight up tolling and being given the permission, for if we could toll all of our interstates right now, our urban interstates, I bet you our legislators would go with that right now.
Carlos, your earlier comment about the Highway Trust Fund having a one-way door brought back memories of previous reauthorization acts where there was all this talk of establishing a firewall to prevent Highway Trust Fund revenues from being used for purposes other than transportation. So
that was our big worry, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. It was definitely. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the relationship between different transportation revenue options and other goals like air quality, climate, equity. To what extent has there been any conversation in your state about these options, different revenue options, and how they might relate to air quality, climate, equity? Is that part of the conversation at all? And I'll just open it up to any and all of you who might want to answer.
Okay, I can't help myself. Sorry. We had legislative interim day this last Wednesday, where we talked about our road usage charge program. We talked about installing license plate readers. That's pretty scary in a very, very conservative state like Utah, and how we would use them to help people pay road usage, no, to help pay their express lane bills. But we had a conversation about what I saw as the future for road usage charging and the hot lanes, in that for us, the growth rate is what's scaring us. We're a big geography in the state, but 65% of Utah is owned by the federal government. And in the urban area, we're the 7th, I think, most urbanized state in the country, meaning most of our population lives in an urbanized area. We have mountains and lakes. And so we have very little room for transportation and for where our people live. About 25% of our land is available for the public and the private sector to live. And so we're really nervous about congestion. And so the idea of being able to, I call them policy levers that a road usage charge program can allow. For us, the conversation around congestion pricing and being able to vary the rates based on the levels of congestion is basically the next step, going from the express lane, the variable pricing, to the full road system. That was a conversation our legislators appreciated, and they kind of nod their head and say, I can see how that could be beneficial in the future. And that's why this is good for us to learn about. Our legislature passed a law this last session, eliminating and forbidding any DEI offices in the state of Utah. And so in all the colleges and all the state offices, so the idea to use equity as a way to make decisions in terms of where money goes is against the law in the state of Utah. So we're not thinking about equity, but air quality, yes. So the ability, and I liked Asha's information from their research, the public responds much better to something that they see and feel. And so when we talk about air quality, they yes, we need to do something about that. And so the whole conversation around greenhouse gas emissions or climate change is a step removed from, I think, the general public, and they have a hard time getting emotional about that. But if we can talk about how these decisions will help impact something that you feel and see every day, they're much more open to that conversation.
Thanks, Carlos. Ed, Tim, any thoughts?
From Oklahoma's perspective, not a whole lot different than Carlos in Utah. We don't have any areas in the state of Oklahoma that are in non-attainment. So, but that does not mean that we're not concerned with air quality. It's something we pay particular attention to because we don't want to get into non-attainment. So it's something we're certainly paying attention to. It's not driving the conversation here in Oklahoma, but again, it's certainly a part of the conversation. And the thing that I think sometimes goes unnoticed is Oklahoma is an all of the above state, and we're thought of often as oil and gas. But that's not the only energy we produce. We are one of the leaders in renewable energy. Certainly wind energy has become a really primary component of our energy sector, along with solar. And again, I think all of that plays into the conversation. And, the environmental aspect of it is certainly something, again, that's not driving the conversation here in Oklahoma, but is absolutely part of the conversation. And I think that is going to factor more and more heavily into our decision making on a go forward basis.
Tim, thanks for raising that point that your energy portfolio is diverse. We were talking about diverse portfolios earlier. That is certainly the case when it comes to energy sources in Oklahoma. Ed, sorry about that.
Yeah,
please
not at all. My fault. And it's diddles for me again. Carlos and Tim brought up great examples of the conversations that are occurring across the nation in this realm. For us in Hawaii, like I said, we have really aggressive clean energy goals, and because of that, some of the advocates came out against our road user charge bill because they thought it would be a detraction from converting to electric vehicles. When we showed them, though, the numbers that vetted out that the cost for road user charge is less than 1% the cost of owning that vehicle, it made total sense to move forward in the end, especially because we're going to have this conversation sooner or later. Better have it now, better to have that vehicle in place now for us to have this this clean conversation versus having it down the road when it affects a whole bunch of other people.
Great. Okay. So I'm going to ask some specific questions to each of you. This one is for Carlos and Tim. Both of you represent pretty conservative states, and some people view RUC as antithetical to conservative values because of the perception that collecting fees based on how much you travel represents big government, and on the idea that RUC is an unwelcome intrusion into people's lives. Carlos, do you want to start?
Sure, I'll start with that. First of all, you have to lead with you can't assume they're going to appreciate your value. And so, as a conservative state, we don't want to pass on liabilities to future generations. I remember I got a call from a New York Times reporter back when we raised the gas tax in 2015, and they said this: "Well, Utah's a conservative state. Why would you raise the gas tax?" It's because we don't want to pass on unfunded liabilities to future generations. It is a fundamentally conservative principle to take care of what you have. And I think it goes back to that. It's being responsible about funding the things that government should fund. So we're very focused on keeping, what is the role of government versus the private sector. We don't compete with the private sector. And transportation is something our legislature and governors have always believed is a role of government. And if we're going to do it, we need to make sure that we don't just, let everything fall apart and let the people that come after us have to deal with it, because good roads cost less, right? It's a fundamental concept that our legislators understand.
Thank you, Carlos. Tim, your thoughts?
First and foremost, I wouldn't lead you to believe that we are anywhere near solving that concern, because it is a concern. But just as Carlos points out, I think it is a function of making sure we're providing good information to the public, around this subject matter, because the management of any data that's collected is what everybody's really concerned about. How are you taking care of that? How are you being responsible? And, from a responsible perspective, again, that conservative concept, Oklahoma believes in making investments in the future. And again, we understand very clearly that the traditional revenue streams that have supported transportation are beginning to flatten. It's not going to affect Oklahoma as quickly as some other states, but it will have an effect on us. And we know that we've got to overcome that. The conversation that we're into right now around road user charge is not just limited to, how are we going to accomplish it, but why we're doing it, which I think is equally as important. And also, we have to overcome this minutia that's around cost of collection. How do you overcome that? That's a huge challenge. How do you offer a variety of different mechanisms that may suit different user types that you're going to experience? We're a rural state. When you talk to our rural population about a road user charge, they immediately go to fairness. And quite frankly, they're being treated unfairly right now with a volumetric motor fuel tax.
Yes.
And we've got to increase and enhance the understanding around that concept. But we've got a lot of work to do. And the only thing that is going to help us with that is time. The good news is we started this conversation several years ago. And again, driven by a legislative initiative and some conversations we were having. But we have a long informational campaign that we're going to have to go through. And we're going to have a lot of questions. And really, that's the important side of this, is we're being asked very difficult questions to answer. And we've got to continue to explore options and withstand that scrutiny as we transition these revenue streams.
Tim, I have another question for you. Oklahoma recently wrapped up a pilot program called the Fair Miles Pilot. Can you say a word or two about that pilot and any lessons learned from that experience?
Absolutely. The Fair Miles Pilot, again, came out of that legislative initiative. And what we learned, I think, is that our public is probably a little more receptive than we might have thought. I think we had about 400 participants in the pilot. I'm not sure we were going to have anybody sign up, whenever we started down that path. And then it's, some of the things that we learned is, vehicle telematics is, as much as we like to talk about smart vehicles, when it comes to trying to translate that into a road user charge, they ain't that smart yet. So the technologies are going to have to continue to evolve and advance. Quite frankly, the manufacturers are going to have to get a whole lot more receptive to sharing the data that they collect. And, so there are a lot of challenges that are going to have to be that we're going to have to overcome. But I think what it really brought forward to us is, as you consider that cost of collection, and make no mistake, I understand that collecting a volumetric motor fuel tax at the rack is not cost free. There's costs associated with it. They're hidden costs. So, it's not something we think much about, but I can assure you, the companies that have to pay those taxes, there's a cost to them to do everything they need to do to be able to do it. But I think if the real exclamation point is it's not just about the privacy concerns. It is about how do we begin to engage the new technologies that are developing super quick to help us overcome some of that cost of collection. AI and all of the things that are happening in that space with the ability to do the analytics. How is that going to be able to layer on top of some of these initiatives and help us with data scrubbing and help us with that cost of collection at a fundamental level? But all of that materialized out of our Fair Miles pilot, which again, I think the legislature understood that. That's why they asked us to do it, because we're in a little bit of an informational vacuum, around some of these concepts. So let's get out and dip our toe in the water and start to have some of these very difficult conversations.
Hey,
Well,
David.
congratulations, Tim, on a very successful pilot. I'm sure everyone can learn from it and build on it. And I think you're right about the potential application of AI and digital infrastructure and everything we're talking about. That's a topic for another panel, but that is absolutely right. Carlos, I think you're about to say something.
Well, I was sorry to interrupt here, but David, Tim mentioned, the data privacy, and I just advise all of us to be careful when we use the term anonymized data. We almost think that is code for don't worry about it. There's no way we can figure out who you are or where you are, but be aware of what your data sizes are and what the data sizes are in geographic areas. And so some very clever people with computers were able to very quickly go into our anonymized data and isolate vehicles down to a very small neighborhood. And so we immediately backed away and started putting more firewalls in place when we, so there's a lot we still need to learn about how we're going to protect the privacy, and we have to always lead with that. So.
Yeah, that's a great point, Carlos. A cautionary tale as we move forward and talk about data privacy and making sure there are adequate protections in place. Yep. It can probably it can never be enough.
No.
And there will always be public concern over that. Ed, I have a specific question for you, and I think you may have touched on it, but it's probably worth going back to. The Hawaii legislature went through a pretty interesting journey in eventually passing a bill that authorizes your RUC program. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience and any lessons learned for other states that might be thinking about RUC legislation?
Absolutely. I think the big lesson going forward is, and Carl touched on this before, he said, anybody who says things are easy never did it before. The second part of it is they're following a blueprint by somebody who already got it done. And for us, we're lucky enough to be able to follow Utah, Oregon, Washington, and California, states that did a lot of really good work up front. And what all of them showed us was public involvement first was by far the biggest piece that you could go with. Making sure that we started our study, not by setting the study path, but by setting up statewide meetings to talk to everybody, to let them know we're starting this study now. We want to get their input now to see how we build that study with their input. with their ends in mind. That was the biggest thing that we could have done. In that beginning, when we started talking to the public, as Tim mentioned, there was misconceptions about what a fuel tax was. Many thought they were paying $3,000, $4,000 when the average person in Hawaii pays $75. So we wanted to make sure that we reset the conversations there. They let us know we're happy to pay for good work. So let us know what your plans are in the transportation space to do good work for the state during that time frame. Setting all those discussions early on were paramount to making sure that our legislators, who are very supportive of this, had the support they needed from the community before they could move it forward. So that was the first step, setting that base with the community. Second step was making sure we separated out all the policy items. Everything that wanted to be thrown in the bucket got taken back out to ensure that we just focused on a direct conversion from fuel tax to road user charge. It came out to be a very simple bill that gave us milestones that we could hit for a total conversion. Nobody wanted to talk about just this year or just EVs. Wanted to make sure we covered everything in totality. But again, just by converting from fuel tax to road user charge, we kind of luck out from what other states have to deal with. We don't have people driving into and off of our borders, so we know exactly where all the vehicles are. We also have our inspection stations that we require every year for everybody to go to get their safety checks done. So we have a point where people can get that data collected without having to track them. It just made our system a lot more simple and a lot more cost effective rather than the other issues that the other states have to deal with. So that's kind of what we had to go through, making sure that we started with the public, made sure that we separated policy issues, then made sure that we came up with an elegant solution to a really elegant fuel tax to start making sure that everything moves forward, making sense.
Sounds like the moral of the story is keep it simple, as you did and as the legislature did.
Absolutely.
All right, so another question for you, Ed. Hawaii's population is incredibly diverse. You have a very large Native Hawaiian community. There's also so much socioeconomic diversity. How did you and the legislature make the case to such a diverse population that the current funding model is broken and that a completely new approach is needed? What kinds of hurdles or challenges did you have to overcome? And you obviously alluded to that early engagement with the public, but how did you overcome those challenges?
We had to show first that we could actually get stuff done. If we didn't pair this with a decade of improvements to the system that people could look at, see, feel, touch, get stuck in traffic in, I don't think this conversation would have gone anywhere. That was the first piece. Second piece, we had to make sure that we broke everything down for the public. The percentage of population that's Native Hawaiian, those that are in the minorities, those that are in areas that are equity, that are challenged. All of those pieces had to be shown to ensure that everybody understood the conversations that we're having. Then we had to show how this system would be more fair for everybody. And not just by everyone paying in their fair share, but also letting them see what they're getting out of this. Right now, when we pay fuel taxes, we pay for the congestion we sit in. And in Hawaii, we have some of the worst traffic in the nation in downtown area. And when we go to road user charge, you no longer pay for that kind of stuff. So all those pieces start moving out. So you're getting a true indication of what your cost should be for the system.
Great. Thank you, Ed. All right. We have time for one final question, which I'm going to throw out for the panel. What advice would you have for states that are painfully aware of the need to find a replacement for lost fuel tax revenue, but they're not quite sure how, where, or when to begin addressing the problem? Any words of wisdom for your peers and your fellow colleagues who represent states that are not quite sure where to start? Who'd like to begin?
I think Carlos should.
Oh man, don't assume that legislators and governors understand this. I think it's complicated, and those of us who sit in our shoes, our seats, we've been in the business for a while, and some of this stuff becomes more second nature, and we presume everyone understands it at the elected official level, and certainly not the public. They certainly don't understand this. find a champion, somebody within the legislature who is willing to help engage in the conversation. So find somebody who you're comfortable with talking to that's willing to have those conversations and take the time. This isn't an elevator speech. This is something that they have to be willing to dig into. And then see if you can't find a way within your processes that you have in your state to have this conversation in a non-threatening way. Don't wait until you're at the edge of the cliff. This conversation is best had when you're 10, 20, 30 years away from, this cliff, this fiscal cliff that we like to talk about, so that people don't feel like their backs are against the wall and you've put them in this bad position, as opposed you're trying to help prepare them to help lead the conversation. And they're going to be seen as leaders in their legislature to be able to help do that. And I'd say lastly, you have to know that these conversations are taking place between legislators themselves at the national level. So NCSL, Alex, they've been having these conversations for many, many years. So members of your legislature are hearing about this from their peers. Don't let that be the only place they hear about it.
Great advice, Carlos. Tim, your thoughts?
And I build on what Carlos points out is there is no magic bullet that's going to come and solve this problem for us. We are on a evolutionary track, and it's going to take many, many decades for us to really get a handle on this. So don't waste time looking for that magic bullet. What we have to do is leverage and maximize our utilization of all of the resources that we can bring to bear while we search for really what the solution to this problem is. And I think recognizing that up front, we're not going to flip a switch and all of a sudden have a road user charge that is going to completely take care of our transportation infrastructure. That will not happen. So the advice I'd have is don't waste a lot of time looking for that. Find what you can focus on and focus on it. Don't get frustrated if you get pushback on one concept or another. Capitalize on the willingness, and I think it doesn't make any difference whether you're a red state or a blue state. I think our citizenry in this country believes in investing in ourselves for the long term. Really put your focus on that. Make sure the public has a clear understanding of what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it. And again, certainly in Oklahoma, I think what we found is that our citizenry is very receptive to having those conversations.
Excellent point. Ed, your thoughts?
Yeah, before I start though, I got to point out that halfway through, I saw that I was the only one without a jacket, so I put mine on.
I saw.
I hate it, but I did it anyway.
I didn't know you had one, Ed.
But I'll say that I'll ditto everything that Carlos and Tim had said again, because they're so good at this. But also, I'll point back out again. Keep it simple as you go down this path. Make sure it's simple for our legislators, our policymakers, and the public to understand and support first. And second, I would say to stay away from focusing on the funding need, and instead focus on the public need. Ensure that they understand that we're not looking for money. We're looking for the improvements that they see, that they say they need. And from that perspective, making sure that we're fair in the way we fill that need.
Great point. Meeting public needs more than we're desperate for money. Well, with that, we have reached the end of this panel, and we have only scratched the surface on this very complex topic. There are many more conversations to be had, including things we just barely touched upon, like the role of AI and digital infrastructure and data and privacy. So much more to cover, but I really want to thank Carlos Braceras, Tim Gatz, and Ed Sniffen for sharing their expertise and perspectives with us. Really appreciate your time. Keep up the great work. And with that, I will now turn it back over to our chair and the executive director of MTI, Dr. Philbrick.
Thank you so much, Trustee Davey. That was just great. It was a wealth of information and certainly some new perspectives that I will need to sit with. But I have to say, I love the actionable intelligence at the end where it was just keep it simple. Let's keep it simple. Let's move forward. Let's do great things. I want to thank you all again for joining us. A particular shout out for the excellent moderating. And to our panelists, our 3 leading state DOT directors, Ed Sniffen from Hawaii, Tim Gatz from Oklahoma, and of course, Carlos Braceras from Utah. And a special thank you to Jeff Davis from the Eno Center for Transportation for sharing his knowledge, and Dr. Asha Weinstein Agarwal, certainly for putting this phenomenal event together and for her 15 years of trend analysis research. We want to thank you and remind you to visit thecommonwealthclub.org if you'd like to become a member or to learn more about upcoming programs. As a reminder, today's program has been sponsored by the Mineta Transportation Institute at San Jose State University. I'm Dr. Karen Philbrick, and now this meeting is adjourned. Thank you so much.